Yeah, so I'm Jacob Buckman. Uh, I got my BA at FHSU in philosophy. My interest in Warhammer just sort of started in the literature, of course, and then expanded into the video games and now the tabletop and all of it, unfortunately. And yeah, I guess Rob.
Yeah, my name is Rob Byer. It's nice to see everybody today. It's so exciting to be able to do an academic conference about Warhammer, which is so interesting. I actually got super into Warhammer during COVID. I was looking for a new sort of creative outlet or thing to think about. And, Warhammer is really intimidating because it's kind of like, where do you even start? So I just started reading the books like Alexander and Sarah before us. I do mostly read the books and play the video games. I haven't quite graduated to the tabletop game yet, but so I just think this is a really interesting and rich topic, and thank you all for putting the conference on and having us today.
So, in this presentation, we'll be exploring the nature of divinity, how the Emperor of Man and the Lion sort of fit into the various theories of the divine. Along the way, we'll sort of touch on some problems one might run into when they're looking at these characters and, as divine entities, and go over some ways to reconcile them. Ultimately, the object is to sort of examine the ironic tension that's created when a divine intervener or a divine character resists their own deification in the way that the lion and the emperor appear to. And so we've got some wonderful depictions here of both young and old of each in their transition from uh, normal transhuman to their sort of deified figure. But as Dr. Byer and I were discussing the various books that we were reading in Warhammer, it became clear with each conversation that in different ways, both Big E and the Lion function as deities in their respective stories. Rob and I both sort of share an interest in the study of theology and sort of the philosophy of theology. But what's also perfectly clear in these books is that both have some sort of resistance or distaste for being worshipped. In the case of the emperor, he has an entire crusade dedicated to his position against the worship in general. At least pre-death nap, he does. Just ask Lorgar how worshiping the emperor against his wishes turns out for you. The lion is much of the same, albeit to a lesser degree, which appears to be the case with nearly all of his instances of divine intervention, sort of more of the same, but to a lesser degree. In the lion's case, after his return to the corporeal galaxy, we sort of see in Son of the Forest uh, that he returns to Avalis just how off-putting deification is to him, although he resists the urge to lash out against it for the good of the people on that planet. Um, However, before we dive into that, I think we ought to first consider the nature of godhood. Surely the lion and even the emperor aren't gods in the strict sense. When we think about gods in the modern theological structures, we often envision something like what we might call the Boo god, especially in the traditional, in the Western tradition. Um, these gods are, benevolent, omniscient, omnipotent things which are characters in the Warhammer universe. I mean, they're certainly not, right? Uh, they don't see all. I mean, and even if they do have sort of an enlarged scope of vision in the universe, they're not what we might think of as, gods in the strict sense. Despite this, however, they do function as gods in the narrative sense and in other ways that don't require theological maximalism. Um, we might consider the emperor and the lion both to be acting as gods in regard to something like Clarke's third law, suggesting that any sufficient advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Rather than technology, though, in this case, it's something like warp activity or understanding of the warp. Being so advanced in understanding of the fabric of our universe that they may as well be gods. and we might call this something like the von Daniken corollary. Uh, Another thing we must consider is the plastic, ever shifting nature of the canon and how that affects how we view these characters. Um, Over time and between editions, and obviously not just in the novels, but in the playable game, the tabletop game, we get stories that sort of back off of certain things and bolster other things. Something that comes to mind is like the second edition Space Wolves will tell you that uh, there are no wolves on Fenris. We get this we get this image of Astartes that are transforming into wolves, and they've since backed off of this sort of position there. All just to say that this sort of leads to an underdetermined and sort of ambiguous canon, leaving room for one to question whether we're dealing with divine intervention or just blind luck. Um, However, we believe there's sufficient evidence for the claims that we make on the nature of the divine, and certainly the role of divine intervener regarding the emperor and to a lesser extent, the lion.
So I'm going to start us out in walking the webway. So this is the part where we're going to kind of chart some of the major sort of academic connections. Thinking about this in the context of some of the other presentations this time, my background and focus is really in kind of analytic style philosophy, which is I think a little bit different than some of the continental and critical theory stuff. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these examples, kind of like thinking about the academic work, and then we'll look at how there are specific cases of information or depictions in the fiction of some of these things. So we are going to start by talking about providence. And there's a number of examples of that, or at least something that is close to it, right? The emperor's foresight in laying aside the shield in just the right place, so that at just the right time, the lion will be able to sort of be guided to it and find it. The lion, of course, wakes up at the right time. The lion keeps, we call that, we were calling this mist walking. I'm sure there's like a better formal term for it, but he sort of meditates, or the mists start closing around him and he's walking, and then he gets to somewhere else. And it's always just the right destination at just the right time to do the thing that he wants to do. We have examples of miraculous action, the burning of the Garden of Nurgle, which is an incredible part of the Dark Imperium trilogy. The resurrection of the faithful. I really like all of the Abnett books. Tanith first, and so you see Saint Sabbat coming back as this sort of little girl, maybe. Of course, the Emperor protects sometimes. Thinking about the Forges of Mars trilogy, several of Abraham Locke's miracles, or seemingly miracles, even though he keeps saying that this isn't a miracle, it's just coincidence. And then we'll talk a little bit about the problem of evil in a second. So thinking about providence, there's this paper by Thomas Flint, who of course wrote he wrote the book Divine Providence that's about this. So we think about features of strong providence. Usually it requires complete foresight and foreknowledge. So God knows all of the stuff that is going to happen. And in particular, some of the debate we're going to talk about in a second is really about where do we place God's knowledge before he even creates things, right? But we need foresight and foreknowledge, active control or influence, and then beneficent, purposive, teleological action is needed to call something strong providence, according to Flint. The Thomist and Molinist views of this that Flint talks about in his paper, and that he and then other people like William Hasker, David Basinger argued about have to do with this idea of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So when God is sort of thinking about the world before the creative moment, he has all of these knowledge of like possibility and necessity, but it isn't until he decides to take some creative step that some set of individuals will come about, will be real. And then the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are supposed to be sort of what would they do if they were in given situations. And the Thomists and Molinists disagree, because on the Thomist view, those either count as in God's natural knowledge, which is God's knowledge of possibility and necessity before any creative act, or his free knowledge, which is knowledge that's after the creative act. The Molinist view, which is popular among some Catholics and has become increasingly popular among like Reformed philosophers of religion, Calvinist philosophers of religion, is that it's actually some kind of middle knowledge. So in terms of similarities, the emperor certainly seems to know the future and act on it to bring about a specific beneficent that is at least for the imperium purpose. Of course, divergences. The emperor is not the creator of reality. The emperor is not sort of omniscient in that full classical theistic sense. And of course, a big thing about this disagreement is sovereignty, and the emperor is not sovereign. The emperor doesn't control literally everything. So again, there are similarities and divergences.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. Oh, you're all right. Another way in which gods interact with those in their domain is, through miracles, right? And this is another way we can classify or think about gods in any given setting. Um, Naturally, what constitutes a miracle isn't exactly clear. Of course, the ever rational David Hume suggested that in his inquiry concerning human understanding, that we can view miracle as a kind of transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity, um, or by some interposition of some visible agent, um, invisible agent. I'm sorry. And Martin holds a similar position, describing these transgressions as something beyond the nature of us, what we are as humans, what we're capable of. And with this in mind, we might think of ways in which the emperor creates transgressions against the laws of nature in the rescue of Euphrates Keeler, like in False Gods, when time surrounding Kirill Sinderman and Mercedes Olatin freezes, allowing them to escape from Maggard, the henchman of Malakhurst. Uh, Later in the story, of course, Euphrates chalks this event up to the will of Big E in the sort of divine intervention that saves them from certain death, because at the time I believe Maggard was on Astartes juice, whatever we want to call that. Um, of course, the will of the emperor, and then if these are the will of the emperor, then they certainly fit the criteria of Martin's position, something beyond what humans are capable of, sort of reaching into the fabric of reality and altering it for the sake of people doing your bidding. And maybe even the first Humean definition, depending on the function of natural law in the Warhammer universe. Interestingly, we can also extend this miracle worker or divine intervener title to Lionel Johnson in certain circumstances, although, again, it's less clear and to a lesser degree. An example of this might be in Son of the Forest, as he miraculously mistwalks between planets, like Rob was talking about, this sort of phenomenon where he sits down and meditates and mist closes in around him, and then he's in the pseudo forests of Caliban just to emerge from the forests exactly where he needs to be, right on time, in order to save the day. Basically, he does this to Avalis and several different planets in Son of the Forest. At first, it's sort of an unconscious thing that he's doing, but towards the end, we see an intention with moving through the fabric of reality, through the warp, and taking people with him, which is a really incredible phenomenon. But this clearly fits Martin's definition of miracles a little bit more neatly than Hume's, due to the sort of volition qualification.
Yeah, miraculous in any way you want to put it, right? So part of I'll go over this quickly. Um, I think sometimes there are sort of 40K versions of the problem of evil, right? Why doesn't the emperor stop my hive city from being raided by orcs? Where's the emperor? Of course, a member of the sororitas hears you talk about that, you're going to get a bolter round. But it would not be uncommon, right, as a way to think about this. And you see characters in the fiction do this, and certainly in discussions online, people wonder about this. So think about this as really a version of the problem of evil. I wanted to briefly talk about the idea of skeptical theism. So skeptical theists, I'm drawing on, at least in this particular thing, an exchange between Daniel Howard Snyder and Michael Bergman and William Rowe or Bill Rowe about this. So skeptical theists basically want to say we just don't actually have we're not in a good epistemic position to make a judgment about whether God has goods that are appropriately connected to the evils that we suffer in the world. So, think about this. If I am, down on my knees, I'm messing with my garden, I don't see any slugs. Maybe that gives me some reason to think there aren't any slugs, at least not visibly in my garden. Or if I open the fridge, I see there's no milk. I close and say, man, I guess there's no milk in the fridge. Both of those cases are ones where we're in a good position to make the judgment that we're supposed to be making. But think about this. I don't know a lot about chess. If I'm watching two chess masters or grandmasters play and one of them goes, oh, that's checkmate in 15 moves, I might not be able to see that or detect it. Or if I'm listening to a physicist colleague of mine talk about quantum mechanics and he says, oh, blah, 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 this thing implies this, I might not be able to see it or understand it, right? And so the question is, where are we in the position to understand what the emperor is doing? Or maybe even if I'm a regular person on Avalos, to understand what the lion is doing. Is it the case that I would be in a good position to know whether they had good reason and it's connected to my suffering? Or is it the case that they are so far beyond me that, even if they have a reason, it's not something that I probably can make a judgment about. So we just thought that was a kind of similarity that you can see people make in the text and certainly in discussions online. And then just briefly, we wanted to talk about this idea of sort of other ways that the emperor is similar to deities. So, right, the emperor is certainly theistic. He seems to be very active. Lots of cases of saints, right? Saint Celestine, Saint Sabbat, and then, of course, the Legion of the Damned. Of course, as we said earlier, all of this is on epistemically shaky ground, but it seems like that is pretty direct intervention of some godlike being like the emperor. The emperor is also the object of prayer and belief, and we see that belief seems to function in the Warhammer 40k universe much like it does in the books Small Gods by Terry Pratchett and American Gods by Neil Gaiman, where the idea is there's sort of belief is the thing that calcifies and builds something to a god. And there's a great discussion between an Eldar character and Guilliman in Dark Imperium, where he makes the same kind of claim about Guilliman. So, again, and as we see in parts of the Son of the Forest, the people are already starting to worship and talk about Lionel Johnson like he's a god. The emperor is an object of sacrifice, right? Psychers and the Golden Throne. And then, of course, the object of conceptual change and refinement with the ecclesiarchy, Euphrates Keeler, and non-heretical divine depictions on different planets. There's room for lots of diversity to some extent, right? Not heretical in the imperial cult, as long as you don't go too far. And that Fiorenza and Kaufman piece is a work by a couple of theologians that talk about just how the concept of God has changed pretty radically over time.
Yeah, and so I mean to add to this, right? Briefly touching on some scholarship, concerning divinity. We have the Hudson piece. W.D. Hudson wrote this piece about just basically 4 criteria for likeness to God or religious worship. Is it an object of belief? Pretty clear that the emperor is definitely, and the lion in certain circumstances is. Whatever is a god is aware of their believer. Again, right down the middle of the road. Is an agent, absolutely. And whatever is a god is transcendent. And this is where we get to some really interesting philosophical stuff. In what ways is the lion and the emperor transcendent? Obviously, they're called transhuman warriors, right? They're sort of transcending us in physical ways, but also in mental and the magical kind of ways that we see in the story as well, which are in a capability to interact with the warp in a way that even the psychers of the human species are not able to do. And they both go beyond human capabilities in this way. And a similar thing happens in the Mendelssohn piece, but in science fiction specifically. Farah Mendelssohn speaks about in an article titled "Religion and Science Fiction." I think pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's one of the last pieces in the Cambridge Companion to Science Fiction.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And they have this concentration on ritual, missionary impulses, which I mean, of course, we have the Great Crusade pushing, the human species out into the galaxy, transcendence, and an ambivalent nature or ambivalent attitudes toward humans, which I think is interesting with the examples of just the sheer existence of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but also Space Marines' ambivalence towards the particular human well-being, even though they're sort of fighting for humans at large. And then religion and oppression. And the ecclesiarchy, we can see this through the Carcharodon's novels, like Outer Dark. We see the ecclesiarchy sort of oppressing these planets of people that they're affecting. Which finally brings us to the resistance, right? The resistance of the divine interveners. And literarily speaking, if indeed the Emperor and the Lion are acting as gods, they're performing the literary role of divine intervener in the Warhammer universe, we can sort of examine their resistance towards their own deification through something like a lens of sort of character role ironic tension. Much like Milton's Satan character in Paradise Lost, or the blinding of Gloucester in Shakespeare's King Lear. It seems as though the ironic rejection of deification, while acting as a divine intervener, is meant to highlight or comment on some observation about human nature that may otherwise be more or less unintuitive. It appears to me as though this commentary is highlighting the inherent human proclivity for mythologizing or deifying truly incredible events or people, while also recognizing the ill effects that these mythologies tend to have on their creators or worshippers. And this is really, I think, what's at the heart of major questions asked through the Horus heresy and even through 40K novels too. The whole beginning of the Horus heresy, from Horus Rising through Flight of the Eisenstein. Questions like, are humans inherently worshippers? Are we denying an essential part of ourselves if we deny this? And what good does it do for a god to deny their divinity? And we can compare these questions sort of side by side, Emperor and Lion, and see sort of different interactions that come along, right? The Lion doesn't deny his divinity so vehemently, and the Avalesians sort of thrive in their hope to overcome Seraphax in Son of the Forest. And then we have the Emperor, who kicks off an entire eternal war. So, I mean, we get this sort of ironic tension, I think, that's meant to highlight something in human nature, and of course bring to a head sort of these questions to ask about ourselves. And these are all of our references that we used.